Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for our Somos Latino Poetry Roundtable. We're delighted to be here with you and with our panelists. My name is Elena Larvivaz, and I'm a professor of Spanish at Rutgers, Newark, and the director of the Somos New Jersey Poetry and Culture Festival, which is a collaborative project between the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies and the Graphic Design Program of the Arts, Culture, and Media Department. The program today is presented as part of Latino Poetry Places We Call Home, a major public humanities initiative taking place across the nation in 2024 and 2025, directed by the Library of America and funded with generous support from the National Endowment for Humanities and Emerson Collective. We'll put links in the chat for the Latino Poetry Anthology, as well as the Latino Poetry Reader, which has a wealth of resources. And we'll also post a link for the Somos Festival, which will be held on campus in March. And I don't know if you can see my copy here. I really cannot recommend this anthology too highly. It's just an amazing collection. And I now have the great pleasure of introducing our panelists. Rigoberto Gonzalez is editor of Latino Poetry, the Library of America anthology that I just showed you. He's Principal Humanities Advisor for the Latino Poetry Places We Call Home project. Gonzalez is Distinguished Professor of English at Rutgers University, Newark, where he is also Director of the MFA program in Creative Writing. Laura Joan Noel is the author of 8 books of poetry, including Transversal, named a Book of the Year by the New York Public Library, and Invisible Movement, Nuyorican Poetry from the 60s to Slam, winner of the LASA Latino Studies Book Prize. A National Translation Award finalist and a Mellon Letras Boricuas Fellow in Poetry, Noel lives in the Bronx and teaches at NYU. And last, but by no means least, Jason Cortez is Chair of Spanish and Portuguese Studies at Rutgers University, Newark, and co-director of Somos. His areas of interest include Caribbean literature, Latinx studies, Puerto Rican literature and culture, cultural studies, gender studies, and critical theory. He is the author of the book Macho Ethics, Masculinity and Self-Representation in Latino Caribbean Narrative, as well as numerous articles on Caribbean and Spanish American literature and culture. I will now turn it over to our distinguished panelists. Please put your questions for our panelists in the chat so we can share them during the Q&A at the end. And I'll be here monitoring the chat along with our amazing graduate TA, Esperanza Santos. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Elena, for that wonderful welcome remarks and that introduction. Welcome, everybody. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenidex, bienvendos, and other languages that we might think of. I have the great joy and privilege today of moderating this conversation, this roundtable, dedicated to the celebration of the publication of this wonderful tome, Latino Poetry, the Library of America Anthology, which was edited by our great friend and colleague, Rigoberto Gonzalez. We, as Elena said, we will take questions. Please drop them in the box, and around 4:50 or so, we will entertain some of these questions and hopefully have time for a nice dialogue. For all the people out there and tuning in via the magic of Zoom, well, welcome. My name is Jason Cortez. And before we start, I'd like to quick shout out to my sister who just had her birthday. I'm using these platforms to celebrate my people nowadays. It's always a birthday. Happy birthday, Anabel. Feliz cumpleaños. Te amo mucho. Anyway, before we start, just a quick explanation of our format today. We're going to entertain some questions, but we're also going to have some poetry. So we have 2 incredible poets. So they're gonna be nice to us, and they're gonna regale us with some readings. So as a sort of invocation, we're gonna have a couple poems read, and then we're gonna start with our discussion today. There you go.
Thank you. Gracias, Jason. And thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. So we're gonna open with a few poems. I wanted to bring in into this space Francisco X. Alarcón, the very important gay Chicano poet who is no longer with us, and also a very important mentor of mine. And one of my favorite poems of his is this poem in Spanglish, in which he entertains this notion of beso and kiss. It was one of the first poems that I heard him read in person, and so every time I read this poem, I always think about him and everything that he meant to me as both a mentor, as a teacher, as a guide, and as a writer, as a poet. This is Un beso is not a kiss by Francisco X. Alarcón. Un beso es una puerta que se abre, un secreto compartido, un misterio con alas. Un beso no admite testigos. Un beso can't be captured, traded, or sated. Un beso is not just a kiss. Un beso is more dangerous, sometimes even fatal.
Ura?
Thank you so much, Jason, and thank you, Rutgers Newark. Thank you, Rigoberto, for blessing us with Maestro Alarcón's words. I will begin with a poem by Sandra Maria Esteves, who was a foundational poet in the Nuyorican tradition and whom I also consider a mentor. And just one thing to mention about these two poems I just thought of is thinking also about the many differences, right, between our Spanishes, right, and the many commonalities, perhaps, and that's one of the strengths of this anthology, right, as opposed to a kind of essentialist view of what Latino poetry is. It's thinking very much about the proliferation of differences, and to go back to Alarcón's poem, almost the untranslatability, right? Our language is our body ultimately, and no one's language is going to be the same as anybody else's. So this is Sandra Maria Esteves thinking about um, love, right, from the perspective of the Nuyorican woman's body, but also in the context of an Afro-diasporic tradition that syncopates poetic language. Mambo love poem. Carlos y Rebecca dance across the floor. They move in mambo cha-cha that causes the sweat of their bodies to swirl in a circle of tropical love. Carlos y Rebecca move and the room fills with blazes of red. Flaming pianos breezing spicy tunes as coconuts fall from palm trees ancient to these children, as coconuts fall from imaginary palm trees ancient to Borinquen souls. Imaginary coconuts fall to the beat of their feet in rhythm with the talking African drum. Rebecca y Carlos glide across the floor, and two become one in the land of salsa. The sweat of their bodies mingles with flute, blowing high over splintered wooden floors in notes that soar beyond the rooftops of El Barrio. They forget their pain in this land of joy as the clave answers the singing African conga, the dancing African drum, the conga quinteando, the African tongue. Rebecca y Carlos become one like two birds flying through the open sky in mambo cha-cha to celebrate their joy, their feet no longer touching the ground. They dance, becoming jibaros in eagle wings, as Shango, Cabiosile, enters their bodies. Their sweat fuses with light. Like thunderbolts in a fiery desert, great wings galloping in flight, the light in their feet dancing the African beat with the singing African drum, the conga quinteando the African tongue, marking the warrior's rhythm with the singing, dancing drum. Shango, Cabiosile, enters their bodies. They flow magically into one. Sandra Maria Esteves.
Thank you both for those incredible poems. And invocating the invocation of our ancestors is always key to set the mood right. So I'm just going to ask a few questions, and hopefully, we can get a conversation going. So this question is for Rigoberto. In editing the Latino Poetry Anthology, how do you approach the task of curating right? You have such a diverse range of voices, historical figures, contemporary poets. So what's the guiding principle? How does one become an editor of such a collection?
Well, let me tell you, even the process of selecting the editor was a difficult one. I had to be interviewed twice, I guess, to test out my knowledge of Latino poetry, because many people in the room know who I am, but people in other spaces do not know who any of us are, or even our literature. And that was one of the first challenges of curating an anthology, is that I think that Library of America was under the impression that after they had published the African American anthology, that the Latino anthology would just kind of be a very similar project, in terms of not only what was available in the archives, but also the ways in which the current African American poets look at their poetic ancestors. And I try to explain that we look at ours, the colonizers, have very different terms, very different lens. We don't have the same sort of level of pride. Many of us don't. And also the colonizer languages. I mean, there's English and Spanish. They're both colonizer languages. And also, Latino, just like African American or even Black, is not monolithic. So how do you even begin to compress all of these voices, all these experiences into one anthology? And I thought, well, instead of looking at it that way, let me sort of look at it through an insider's point of view, which was like, what is it that I'd like to have people who may not know who we are or do not understand who we are recognize about who we are, what we write about, and but also what are some of the commonalities besides the Spanish language, besides the colonial history, besides perhaps even some of our names, our names. And I thought, well, if anything, under the umbrella of this of movement is what I discovered that even though our colonizer ancestors were looking for a new home, there's ways in which even in the movements of Latin Americas into the United States were also movements, whether or not these were movements that we initiate ourselves, migration, or whether we were forced into them, exiles or refugees. There's always movement, right? And so I thought movement and the search for home, missing home, all of these things came together or were coming together, and they came together actually after reading Judith Ortiz Cofer, the great Puerto Rican American poet, this poem which I want to read, because when I read this poem, I thought, wow, I mean, this is a very different way of negotiating going back home or understanding home, the complexities of family. It's a very moving poem, and it's called Because My Mother Burned Her Legs in a Freak Accident. And I want to read this because this is what really gave me the answer, because we're trying to find, what's the one sort of unifying theme, and this was finally did it for me, because I thought, yeah, because sometimes going home is a very fraught and difficult situation. Some of us cannot go home for whatever reason, right? And some of us going home means having to confront difficulties and issues. It's not just oh, we're going home for Christmas, it's not always fun and it's not always pleasant, but that's our complexity of who we are. And I thought, well, that's who we are, so I want to represent an anthology in which we negotiate home in very different in the various ways. So this is a poem that actually opened up that huge door that gave the theme to the anthology. This is Judith Ortiz Cofer, Because My Mother Burned Her Legs in a Freak Accident, also a New Jersey girl. I am flying south over the Atlantic toward one of those islands arranged like shoes on a blue carpet. She lies in bed waiting for the balm of my presence, her poor legs pink as plucked hens. When her gas stove exploded as she bent over her soup, the flames grabbed her ankles like a child throwing a tantrum. So she has summoned me transatlantically, her voice sounding singed as if the fire had burnt her from within. She wants me there to resurrect her flesh, to reverse time, to remind her of the elastic skin that once sustained me. She wants me to come home and save her, as only a child who has been forgotten and forgiven can. So that's a very complicated poem. It's like it's love, but it's also owning up to the tensions of family and this sort of this drifting apart that happened between a daughter and her mother, which you can also see it as a sort of longer metaphor for the way that some of us have to negotiate with our homelands. Is like we left, or some of us were thrown out. Some of us were ushered out. Some of us were invited out, and not all of us are welcome back. Or if we do, it's for very complicated terms. So that's like the long answer to like how finally this anthology started coming together for me. And so then, and home is not just a place or a house or homeland. Sometimes home is language. Sometimes home is culture, or home is also the body, which is another way, which is one way that I was able to look at some more non-binary trans poets that I include in the anthology.
Thank you. That's great. I love Julie Ortiz cover. Yes, it is in the anthology. As is Where You Need to Go, which is another one of her incredible poems that I love. Notions of home, haunting, all that good stuff that I like. Necropoetics, if we may. What do you think about that? Because I know that you also wrote the essay for the companion piece. And so even though you're not an editor per se, you are a collaborator of two sorts, poetic voice, but also somebody who's thinking about this in broader terms.
So, I mean, what do I think of what? Of the,
What do you think of this notion of home? What do you think of
yeah,
what Rigoberta was just explaining in terms of poetry in a way becoming this home of sorts?
yeah.
Um,
I mean, I definitely agree with and resonate, right? It resonates with me, Rigoberto's idea of finding a home in language, right? And that's true for a lot of poets whose, bodies are marked in different ways, right? So thinking about, queer poets and so on. But I think it's complicated because, you have also poets who have been in what is now the US for centuries, right? And so, right, the border crossed us, we didn't cross the border, right? And then this anthology is also thinking about poets situated in Puerto Rico. And so, what relationship does that have to more traditional geographies of Latinidad, right? So going beyond the kind of monolithic idea of home, and I think thinking also about the places where kind of the drama in our life plays out. And so in that sense, I wanted to think about names, right? Also as one thing that supposedly marks us and gives us a home, but that can also be alienating in a possible context. In terms of my own situatedness, right? I remember an editor, obviously non-Latino, once in rejecting my poem said, "You have an interesting mix of street and form," right? Uh, and I think of myself as someone who is, positioned in a very specific way, as someone with pretty elite and privileged academic formation, but who also came of age in the New Rican Poets Cafe, right? And very much trying to navigate, right, the those spaces between street and form. And one of the things I try to do in my poetry is think about how form can also be a home. Paradoxically, that can also be forms that were imposed upon us, right? And if you think about both English and Spanish prosody, right, as imposed, right, on indigenous and Black populations, right, that's one source of Latino poetry. So I do stuff that's more influenced by someone like Esteves, right, who is thinking about a syncopated Afro-diasporic approach to form from a Nuyorican perspective. But then I'm blown away by someone like Rina Espaillat, right, who is working in much more traditional forms, but almost inflecting them so that we see a kind of fissure in the form where something else becomes possible. So I'll just read um, this beautiful sonnet from Espaillat about the question of naming. On hearing my name pronounced correctly, unexpectedly, for once. The voice over the wire trills my R, snares me with soft diminutives, and waits for me in our shared language to allow my words to trace like fingers down a scar, stories we've known since childhood, places, dates in brackets on worn stones. He tells me how our old ones slip away, forgetting now faces and names. My cousin hesitates. I take this name again and say goodnight. Odd how the gringo tongue that shifts translates you into something it can say, but far from what you were, that never gets you right, rolling you round too long, too smooth, too light, loves you at last to who it says you are. So again, I'm thinking of a very kind of canonical sonnet, but I'm struck by the word gringo, which sounds so ugly in the kind of incredible formal elegance of the poem. So it's this great moment of dissonance, right, where the violence of that gringo imposition, right, of their language, right, on the speaker, in a way works so powerfully because the rest of the sonnet is so elegant and so almost like shimmeringly beautiful, as is so often the case with Espaillat. I should say Espaillat is still with us, as is Santa Maria Esteves, who I read previously. So thinking also of Espaillat as a Dominican American poet and librarian, right, who was active before, right, there was a kind of Latino civil rights movement necessarily, right? So I think there's a certain kind of social movement history of Latino poetry, which is very important. I know Rigoberto knows that history deeply and identifies with it. I've written about that from a Nuyorican perspective. But I think Espaillat reminds me that Latino poets have been making home in all kinds of ways and using the tools given to them, even if those are, right, very traditional sonnets.
And also, just as a little fun, necessarily not fun fact, but I mean, Espaillat's family they were exiled, during the Trujillo
Thank
regime
you.
because
Yeah.
of her father's involvement there. But yeah, absolutely. And so, and Espaillat became like or is continues to be a long-term activist. I mean, the work that she does for different people. And not always necessarily reflected in the poetry, but and yet I would argue that the poetry itself becomes a political language, right? And then she does it so beautifully, and just like another poet that does this, Julia Alvarez, using form, right, and to subvert, all of a sudden where she's writing about themes, or she's writing about she's writing things that they think would not be polite enough for the sonnet, because the sonnet's supposed to be a polite form, and she's like, well, let's break away from that, you know. And she does it so well, like Espaillat does as well.
Yeah, I love Espaillat though, because I love Alvarez too, but Espaillat does these ones where she self-translates the form. So you'll see, so a lot of what I do in transversal, right, was, wouldn't be possible without Espaillat, which I had to pick a poet whose work was very relevant to my own recent poetry. So translating formally perfect in both languages, but two totally different experiences in each. So it also again highlights that untranslatability of experience that we mentioned with Alarcón and the other poets.
Yeah.
I love the whole thing with the name too, right? I mean, I do have an American name, but my last name is Cortez. So to hear Jason Cortez is just an oddity, right? So when somebody says Jason, I know I'm like, okay, so I'm in Puerto Rico somewhere. So this is one of those poems that I love, and obviously form so important. The sonnet, it just conveys so much by
Mhm.
just being a sonnet, right? Like
Yeah.
if we're going to talk about the language of the colonizer, right? I'm thinking about the Garcilasos, the Petrarchs of the world, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm immediately thinking about that Donna Angelicata, but this is a whole different ballgame.
Mhm.
And it sort of invokes for me Manuel Ramos Otero, right? All those sonnets that he had that were Invitación al Polvo, which, Invitation to Dust, which were, you know,
Mhm.
devastating poems about sexuality and love and all that stuff. In that Puerto Rican, let's call it note, I suppose.
Mhm.
As an additional context, the poet Vincent Toro, who's also in the anthology and who I think was a student of Rigoberto's, so representing, right, Rutgers Newark in the house, right, once told me he didn't think there was such a thing as a decolonial sonnet. He thought the sonnet, by its very nature, again, you could call something a sonnet potentially, but a sonnet in the traditional sense, there was no way to work with that, right? And I fought him on Facebook, and I'm like, no, there are decolonial, and I sent him like Patricia Smith sonnets, and I think ultimately maybe it was an Espaillat sonnet where I think he's like, okay, maybe. So
I mean, she makes such a strong argument for the sonnet, right? Um, and my siglo de orista friends, of course, are like, what do you mean the sonnet is not viable? So anyway, so moving forward, Rigo, let's go back to like you just mentioned Toro, which of course, to me it alludes to the good mix that we have in this anthology. Traditional, of course, Martí, who's very close to my heart, but also then you have people like Ana Pornoy Bremer, who, shout out to Anita, wherever you are, Puerto Rican poet who very young, who was also a student of Rigo's. So how, how do you think the trajectory of Latino poetry has shaped or has been shaped by a broader sense of tradition of, of course, the sonnet right now, but tradition in general?
Yeah, let's see. Well, the one of the hardest parts about the anthology was narrowing down the selections in the contemporary period, because all of a sudden there's this explosion, right? This explosion of poets. And I think I began with certain guidelines and said, well, you got to have like 2 books. But then, I had to also look at certain groups that were not represented with, who had 2 books, for example, so many Afro-Latino poets, because there was this resurgence. Now there's so many that are barely coming up, barely finding space in not only in our publishing houses, but also in the any kind of public performance arena. Now we're seeing this huge explosion. That, what, I'm gonna seek some of these voices out, and they were amazing because they also taught me how the African American traditions were important in shaping very contemporary Latinx poetry. We mentioned, Patricia Smith in the sonnet. I mean, Terrence Hayes in the American sonnet. I mean, that's what the American sonnet is a complete redefinition and reinvention and reimagination of the form. And that's, led by African American poets in this country. And so, as an example of that, we have the Dominican American writer, Dianelli Antigua. She's got a poem called "The Golden Shovel with Solstice," and Golden Shovel is a form that Terrence Hayes created. And in this particular poem, there is a huge, the Golden Shovel, in very succinct terms, uh, dialogues with another poem, so that the last word of each of the lines is actually a poem from another poet. And in this case, the poem is the very famous poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, "We Real Cool." And so this is an example of this. And I see it all over, not only with Afro-Latinx poets, but really contemporary poets, the influence by African American poetry in this country. Because, I shout out to Kalakanam, who has really shaped that incredible body of work, contemporary work. And they become important influences, for Latinx poets, because they are helping us or guiding us towards connecting these two, the poetic with the political. When I was coming up in the 1990s as a poet, and that question was always there: can poetry be political? Can poetry be political? I mean, that question is like, if ever I hear it, it's like, man, you got to get in your time machine, because that is not even no longer a question anymore, right? Not because it has been answered, but because it should have been asked in the first place. Because the asking was an actual an effort to censor and to silence and to dismiss, right? And so all of a sudden, here African American poets showed us how it was done. it's like, we're not even going to bother with that question. We're just going to write our work. And so I think that that was an important lesson that contemporary Latinx poets, have learned. But I do want to read, just for fun, this poem by Daniela Antigua called Golden Shovel with Solstice, after Gwendolyn Brooks and Terrence Hayes. When we found her sex positions book, we didn't think it was real. My mother wasn't cool enough for sex. We flipped through the pages, turning left, studying where each body fit in this school. The detailed figures of the man and woman, the parts we hid under cotton, kept from lurking skin, a hand, a finger, the late night moon with its barred light. We lay our bodies on the bed to strike the pose, mimic the face down, the ass out straight. We laughed and snorted. We looked like pigs singing oinks, our faces in the trough, this sin. I don't want to say that what we did next, that we touched our own bodies, thin arms reaching to what bits of hair we'd grown, the beginning of a secret thing, or that we reached for each other, a fumbled jazz of grips on this solstice in June. If today I could replay our hand song, we would deny its music when we each died a little on that bed, notes ending too soon. Now, besides completely reversing the energy of the original poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, I mean, the idea of bringing in these taboo subjects to the forefront, not only sexuality, but the mother's sexuality. I mean, it's an incredible poem. And so that's another thing that I was looking for in the poetry, is like poems that really were defying all kinds of expectations that people might have about Latinos, right? Because we're always, oh, Latinos, they're family oriented, they're Catholic, they're, their proper ways in which our culture sort of has shaped its expectation of who we are and how we say it and how we express it. And so I love this poem that defies so many taboos.
Love it. Thank you. Thank you. Let's go back to you, Ura. This is a question that it's right up your alley. I'm just gonna say it, language. So in your work, and of course in your work as a critic, what role does code switching play in the creative process? How does the use of multiple languages enhance or complicate the expression of, I'm going to say identity, but that's like a placeholder in poetry again.
Thank you for that. Yeah, well, I think I wrote one of the essays, as you mentioned, right, where I go into this question in the work of Pedro Pietri, who was a mentor, and I have my Pietri LPs there in the back, and the aforementioned Francisco X. Alarcón, two big influences. And so there's that tradition, but I want to pick up on what Rigo said about African American poets, because I think, all kinds of Black vernacular English are code switching, right? So in the Nuyorican context, and I wrote, a book on the Nuyorican poets, where I was very much thinking about the influence, right, of African American poetry on the foundational Nuyorican traditions. So there's that continuity also. We can't just think of the translingual, right, or the vernacular in a Latino context as relates to Spanish. We have to think of it in terms of also, I would say, Black and Indigenous Latinidades, right, Portuguese, but also the kinds of code switching between vernacular language and poetic language, right, that is part of um, working class, right, and people of color and migrant poetics, in the US more generally. And so there's that same tension, or a similar tension, you could say, in Asian American poetry, certainly in African American poetry. And so in that spirit, I thought I would read something by Edwin Torres, a poet working in the Nuyorican tradition, whose work is very experimental, also someone who's closer to sound art, maybe, than to traditional poetry, and who tours in all these avant-garde festivals in Europe. But if you listen deeply, right, you will hear a kind of rootedness in Boricua vernaculars, including in this poem a reference to Jorge Brandon, El Coco que Habla. I'm sorry to show my other book when I was supposed to be putting the anthology, but just to show you an image of Jorge Brandon, right, the radical nationalist abuelito of the Nuyorican tradition, and a poet who, except for the Nuyorican anthology from '94, I don't think has ever been in print, right? So it's a poet who is central to Edwin's vision, right, of a kind of embodied sound tradition of Nuyorican poetics. But I love that somehow this book lets us, you know, hear the echoes of someone like Brandon, right, in thinking about the evolution of Nuyorican poetics. Edwin Torres, no yo-yo. He's from New York, from Puerto Rico, New York. He's a New Rican, what they call a Riqueño, being new or trigueño, speaking new or Rican, a New York-seeking New Yorker. Is he new or a porter? A port of sherry, sherry, sherry. Porto, Puerto, York, oh, Yoko, el coco que habla, se habla coco, no city, Port of no city Rican. A Puerto Rican is called a Boricua, a Boringua, aboard, this is boarding into my honor. What you saying? What new saying? The new say. Be the new city of York. A Yorkie, a pit, a bull, a toro, a torres, a norres, a city no, a city Yorker, uncorked, a boozer, a bozo, a new bozo. Yo soy bozo in the yo zone. See? Yo soy the new yo. That's some new yo, bro. Yo Rican, see, soy no Rican. He's no Rican from Noricua. He's no you, no yo, no I. The I in I is the new no. I be some of that new no from no Riqua, bro. Edwin Torres. And so one thing, you know, there's a whole backstory to Noricua, which is something we kind of made up as a joke in the South Bronx at a barbecue many years ago. But I think of Edwin as someone who's been thinking about a kind of spiritual emptying out of identity. So paradoxically, if you know, identities are also like imposed on you, right? You don't choose to be marked for your language or your ethnicity, right? And so Edwin's kind of experimental utopian poetics is okay, take all that was imposed on you, right? And you know, reimagine it in a utopian way as this kind of poetics of expressive possibility. So you know, you know, you might be marked as Nuyorican by the work around by the world around you, but you can choose to be Noricua, right? And to embrace an identity that also allows you to imagine identity's negation, right? And a kind of more eccentric, right? Or more playful sense of what identity can be. So that's it. I mean, I answered through Edwin's work, but you know, read my book and read the anthology more than anything.
You know what I love about Edwin's work in general? If you were to tell me that this is your poem, I would believe it, right?
I do
Um,
nothing new. I could read Edwin and Victor Hernandez Cruz and just the folks in the anthology, and I'm honored to say that I write footnotes to folks in this anthology. So if you like my work, buy the anthology. Yeah.
it's just, for those of you who don't know, Urayoan is also a performer, right? So I think performance is a huge part of your poetry. I was earlier mentioning the Esporosos, but even in the poem that was selected here in the anthology, there is that musicality. There is one line in English, one in Spanish. There's so much play. You know, you're such a ludic poet, and Edwin is obviously in
I was
that.
taking notes in the late 90s and early 2000s at the Nuyorican Poets Cafe when Edwin was performing. And I was meeting with Rigo, who was like, you know, helping me out of my cluelessness by helping me think about what the poetry world really looked like, which you have done for many of us. So I want to take this opportunity to thank Rigo for his. I don't think we realize the level to which a whole lot of folks who are now famous, right, would be less famous, right, if it weren't directly for Rigo's work. And this anthology to me feels like the summation, right, of many decades of activism on behalf of Latino poetry and Latino literature more generally. So gracias, Rigo.
Yeah, it is horrible to have Rigo as a colleague. You know, my job is just horrible. I got Rigo, I got John Keane, it's nothing. It's just like, it's what a treat. Rigo, you want to add something to that, or do you want to move on to another question?
We can move on. I think we're running short on time. I think we're already at 4:40.
We have, I'd say, we're at the 15-minute mark, so maybe we can entertain one more question, and then we can open it up for, again, for the folks out there. Drop your questions in the chat box, and my colleague Elena Arvivas and Esperanza Santos will be happy to read them, and we can tackle them when the time it's up. All right, so this is a tricky question, right? And I think you've touched upon this question a little bit, but I'm gonna take a risk and I'm gonna go for it. Poetry as a medium of social commentary, right? How do you see contemporary Latino poets addressing present issues such as immigration, which is a big one, especially in light of the election year, climate change, racial justice, all kinds of justices? Are there any poems in the anthology that you like to point out as being key in addressing these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I do appreciate about this, even though our times are very fraught, we have such a history of employing poetry as an avenue for these expressions, so that younger poets that can be very unafraid. They don't have to fight that fight anymore. It's like I said earlier, the whole notion of can poetry be political? Of course, it always has been. And so now it's like, well, we're beyond that. Now let's go ahead and say what we need to say. But there's a couple of poems in here that I felt needed to be included because they're pointing out perhaps to some forgotten details, forgotten historical events, or not talked about enough, that give context to even what we're going through now. And one of them is by Diana Garcia, Operation Wetback 1953. Now, after World War II, there were so many atrocities committed against people of color in the United States. The one that we always think about is the internment camps. The Japanese Americans were interned because they were descendants of Japanese citizens. Well, there was also the Operation Wetback, which was the deportation drive that occurred particularly in the Southwest. My great-grandparents were part of that. But there were the number of people that were deported is unknown, and that's because so many self-deported. They were given plane tickets, train tickets, and that's what my great grandfather and my grandfather and all his brothers and sisters, they self-deported to Mexico, even though they were all U.S. citizens. But anyway, so Diana Garcia's Operation Wetback 1953. Probably the only poem that I've ever read that addresses that particular incident, and I want to read that. Operation Wetback 1953. The day begins like any other day. Your daughter soaks a second diaper, chortles as she shoves her soft-cooked egg to the floor, knees pressed to cracked linoleum. You barely notice as your husband strokes your belly. Mijo, he croons, prophetic plea that squeezes your nagas as if to gauge for ripeness. As he edges past, you notice how his blue shirt blurs against the summer sky, how sky absorbs his patch of blue, then empties. Moments later, a truck groans, moves on, carting rumblings of men headed for the fields. Years later, you tell your son and daughter of that anguished day, how green card migrants vanished from the camps. You tell your children how news gripped the camps of trains headed south loaded with wetbacks. You never tell your children what you can't forget, how you failed to squeeze back, failed to wave goodbye, failed to taunt him with viejo sinvergüenza. You never tell your children how you forget this one man's voice, a voice that brushed your ears, your hair, a pat down your back, a voice that blends with sounds of a truck that never brought him home. So that particular poem I always found very, very moving to Diana Garcia because it's definitely very personal to me and my family history, but it's one of those one of those incidents that gets forgotten, when we talk about the discrimination or the vilification of specifically of Mexican migrants and even citizens and even Mexican American or Chicano citizens by the mainstream media, by the social climate that immediately criminalizes, anybody that's perceived as having crossed the border.
Thank you for that poem. That's brutal. It's an incredible piece of literature. Uda, would you like to say something before we open the floor for questions?
Sure. I mean, just very quickly, I'll be the scholar for a second, and I know Rigo, could say the same thing. Just thinking about from an ethnic studies perspective, how the ethnic studies world we inhabit, right, was actually built to a large degree by poets, right? So poetry is not supplementary to ethnic studies histories and to the spaces that we inhabit. So thinking about places we call home, the university is one of the homes, right? And I feel very privileged to be an ethnic studies professor even at a place like NYU, we can talk about that, right? But especially at places like Rutgers, right? Which is really, it wasn't at NYU's, it was at the Rutgers and the CUNYs and the SUNYs, right? And the UCs, right? At the public universities, right? Where Chicano studies, right? Black studies, Puerto Rican studies, right? Communities demanded to see themselves, right? They weren't gifted that by the institutions. They took over the institution, and it was largely the poets doing that work. So you could think of the poets working with the young lords, right? Who some of whom were poets as well. So there's a whole history of just alternative institutions, right? And creating spaces for ourselves at the borders of the university, but also outside of the university, thinking of people like Ansaldúa, who now everybody loves, but never actually had a 10-year job in her lifetime. So even someone of her stature was in effect marginal to the institution, thinking of women of color feminism, right, as an epistemology and the centrality of people like Ansaldúa and Shiri Moraga, folks in the anthology. And in that spirit, I'll just read Aurora Levens Morales's When I Write Archipelago. Aurora is another mentor for the more creative nonfiction work I'm doing now. And she's also someone thinking about embodied counter histories, right? Working with what we have, working in the community, going outside of institutional archives. So someone who models for me how poetry is part of a broader struggle, right? Of telling histories from below and telling histories that aren't visible, right? Within the dominant languages of the institution. When I write Archipelago, the islands are more than water-bordered lands. They are mountain ranges rooted in salt water, bones of connection, visible only from the air. I sing the islands one by one, their surf-ruffled edges, their sloping beaches and plunging cliffs, the rings of reef-sheltered bays, the wild oceanic swells grinding stone to sand. I sing the dry ones where every drop of rain must be cupped, and the wet ones of palm and fern, moss and orchid, the volcanic peaks and the flat slabs of uplifted limestone, the 1,200-mile arc of Cuba and the tiny specks of scattered cays. The archipelago I write rises from the bones of the planet and is interrupted by reflected light, rises above the skin of water and continues far below. When I say archipelago, I mean continuity and uniqueness, how we are singular and inseparable, boundaries of rough surf, rough passages between our coasts, and one shared bedrock, one tectonic gap, one subduction of vast planetary stone that raises us. When I say Caribbean, say Antilles, say West Indies, say windward and leeward, greater and lesser, I mean that we cry out in different languages as the same storm sweeps our houses into the sea. When I say islands, I mean the endless dance of kinship, pulling us together and apart like tide. When I say islands, I mean we. Aurora Levens Morales.
That's a gorgeous poem. Because I think the other thing, that I wanted to make sure was the different emotional registers that, our politics, even though so many times they are informed or fortified by, anger, or they're informed by, very complex emotions, there's also love. There's also a reaching out to a sense of unity, right? other ways to look at collaborations and not just as collisions. I think that's another thing that happens in when we try to distinguish. Oh well, there's different kinds of Latinos, and sometimes I feel that when we present that, there's a sense of like, well, let's highlight or foreground our differences as if we're in conflict. I thought, and I understand that impulse, but I think, again, but there's ways in which we are actually allies, important allies as well, not just, even though we may be politically on different spectrums, because that is who we are as a complex group. We have very different political leanings. So, and I guess I'm hoping that in a few weeks we're gonna stop hearing this phrase, the Latino vote, because because there's only one apparently. There's one Latino vote, and that's and hopefully it'll be over in a few weeks.
Yeah, we can't wait. We cannot wait for that. So, to our Elena, are we ready to field some questions?
Yes, I think we can. We have a question in the chat. Esperanza, did you want to share the question that we have in the chat?
The one from Charissa. Charissa asks, can you read us a poem of your book that some of us that came here to the US for a better life can relate to?
That's a good one. Let me see. It's gonna be a little bit of a challenge to me. I don't have them memorized, but what's one that I would say? You look too, Wira.
I mean, we don't have enough time for Puerto Rican obituary, but that would be
That'd be one, right? Puerto Rican obituary.
I mean, you can always read that last line because we were just talking about love, right? So that's to me, that's the thing about the epic. It just ends in love.
I'm gonna have to owe you that one, but here's one that I think sort of looks at that through a very different lens, and this is another one, sort of in the vein of the Jules Ortiz Cofer poem that speaks, very much to the complexity of who we are, and also, so this is Lalo Delgado's "Stupid America," which is one of my favorites, and so I'm just going to read it because I think it looks at the same question through a very different lens, because it's a poem that speaks to what I said earlier, the way that we are perceived in a certain way, and because we are perceived in a certain way, we are seen as limited in our intelligence, imagination, in our capabilities, and sometimes we can fight against that. Other times it becomes very difficult depending on the whatever institution that's holding that power. But anyways, this is Lalo Delgado's "Stupid America." Stupid America. See the Chicano with a big knife in his steady hand? He doesn't want to knife you. He wants to sit down on a bench and carve Christ figures, but you won't let him. Stupid America. Hear the Chicano shouting curses on the street. He is a poet without paper and pencil, and since he cannot write, he will explode. Stupid America. Remember the Chicanito flunking math and English? He is the Picasso of your western states, but he will die with 1,000 masterpieces hanging only from his mind. And I just want to say what I love about this poem is that some may read it as a kind of resignation, but no, it's actually pointing out, that the uh, even though there is this force that may be subverting, stopping, creating obstacles, creating adversity, we have power, we have agency, and we are able to fight against that. We're able to surpass that or transcend that, which is one of the emotions I hope people get from, or one of the responses to the book, is that they're tracing ways in which the energy, especially when we look at the United States as a power that won't let us be, to also a place that where we can be, where we can become, right? So I think that I think more complexly expressed in the contemporary poetry, because there are more voices speaking out. There are more voices. So many of the voices from our past were not preserved. So that was one of the challenges, to kind of compensate for that in the more contemporary. It's like, okay, this is happening now, but this is always happening. It's just that we don't have so many of those voices preserved.
Beautiful. I love that poem. I'll just do the end of The Broken English Dream by Pietri, since the obituary is too long. We follow the sign that says, "Welcome to America," but keep your hands off the property. Violators will be electrocuted. Follow the garbage truck to the welfare department if you cannot speak English. So this is America, land of the free for everybody but our family. So this is America, where you wake up in the morning to brush your teeth with the home relief, deleting toothpaste, Operation Bootstrap. Promise you will get every time you buy a box of cornflakes on the layaway plan. So this is America, land of the free, to watch the adventures of Superman on TV if you know somebody who owns a set that works properly. So this is America, exploited by Columbus in 1492, with Captain Video and Lady Bird Johnson, the first Miss Subways in the New Testament. So this is America, where they keep you busy singing, "En mi casa toman bustelo, en mi casa toman bustelo." Coffee ads, right? So they keep us busy with ads and consuming stuff, right? And so
TV.
we don't organize and take over things.
By the way, this is not sponsored by Bustelo, Yaucono.
But we're open to it. We're open. No,
This is a no brand coffee I'm having. I love that. Pietri always brings it home.
Mhm.
did I mention we have a named door at NYU in the English department?
Did you mention?
We have a name door. So someone didn't have enough money to name the building, but they were able to buy the naming rights to the door. So if you go to the English department at NYU, at the front door, it says there's a plaque that reads the Jeff Sutton Door. So just an idea, Rutgers folks follow the NYU model, monetize everything. I'm sure Rigoberto could have, hallways, full floors, right?
That's
Rigoberto Gonzalez Lounge. I think we need that, you know?
that has a ring to it. You know, I think well, we'll talk about that later. I'll start the campaign. Do we have any other questions in the box?
Not right now. I think is it okay if we transition to closing?
Sure.
We are almost to time, and I know everyone's time is really precious. So we don't want to keep you too long. But we just want to thank you so much for joining us, and for this amazing discussion and this incredible anthology. I've been sort of reading along here as you've been reading the poems aloud, and I mean, it's just such an incredible volume. So thank you for being here today to celebrate it, to celebrate Latino poetry, and for giving us that wonderful idea of having our name doors in Conklin. So we will be definitely pursuing that. If anyone is interested here today, please reach out to us. And we'll hope that you'll all be able to join us as well for our Somos festival in the spring. The information's there in the chat. But once again, thank you so very much.